What if I told you that every Mars mission you've ever heard about, from Elon Musk's Starship to NASA's Artemis program, is fundamentally doomed before it even leaves Earth's atmosphere? Not because of bad engineering or lack of funding, but because of invisible forces so devastating that they could turn every astronaut into a walking corpse before they even see the red planet's surface. Right now, as you're watching this, there are billionaires spending hundreds of billions of dollars on a dream that physics itself won't allow. And the scientists know it. They've known it for decades. But here's the thing that's going to keep you up at night. The reasons we can't reach Mars aren't just technical problems waiting to be solved. They're fundamental barriers woven into the fabric of reality itself. I'm going to show you why the Mars mission isn't delayed, it's impossible. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why everything you've been told about humanity's future in space is a beautiful lie. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The very same forces that make Mars unreachable are affecting you right now. In this moment, as you sit there watching this video, your body is fighting them. Your cells are losing the battle, and there's nothing you can do about it. Before we dive into this rabbit hole, hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see every space documentary, every Mars announcement, and every promise about humanity becoming a multi-planetary species. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to know how many people across the globe are having their minds blown simultaneously. Let's start with the most fundamental killer that nobody talks about: galactic cosmic rays. And I'm not talking about the kind of radiation you can shield against with some lead plating. I'm talking about particles moving so fast, carrying so much energy, that they laugh at our pathetic attempts at protection. Here's the reality. Earth sits inside a protective bubble called the magnetosphere, created by our planet's molten iron core spinning thousands of miles beneath your feet. This invisible shield deflects 99.9% of the cosmic radiation trying to kill you right now. You've lived your entire life protected by this force field, never knowing that, without it, you'd have died from radiation poisoning before your first birthday. But here's where it gets terrifying. Mars doesn't have this protection. Its core froze billions of years ago. The magnetosphere died. And now Mars sits naked in space, bombarded by radiation levels that would be considered a lethal dose on Earth every single week. Let me put this in perspective using research from Dr. Francis Cucinotta, NASA's former Chief Radiation Health Officer. In a study published in 2013, he calculated that astronauts on a Mars mission would receive a radiation dose of approximately 1.01 sieverts during the round trip and surface stay. Now that number means nothing to you, so let me translate it. That's equivalent to getting a full-body CT scan every 5 days for 2 years straight. The European Space Agency's Dr. Marco Durante, one of the world's leading experts on space radiation, stated in his 2014 research that this level of exposure would give astronauts a 20% to 30% chance of developing fatal cancer. But here's what they don't tell you in the press releases. That's just the cancer risk. The immediate effects are far worse. Think of it like this. Imagine your DNA as an instruction manual written in the most precise language ever created. Every cell in your body contains this manual, and it's what keeps you alive. Now imagine someone is shooting bullets through that manual 24/7, shredding random pages, scrambling sentences, destroying critical information. Your cells try to repair the damage, but they can't keep up. They start making mistakes, copying errors, and those errors accumulate. The particles I'm talking about aren't like sunlight or even X-rays. These are iron nuclei, helium nuclei, protons accelerated to near the speed of light by exploding stars and black holes. When one of these cosmic bullets hits your body, it doesn't just damage the cell it strikes. It creates a cascading shower of secondary radiation. Like a bullet fragmenting inside a body, each piece causing its own devastation? Dr. Eugene Parker, the legendary physicist after whom NASA's Parker Solar Probe is named, spent his entire career studying the solar wind and cosmic radiation. Before his death in 2019, he made a chilling statement that got buried in scientific journals. The radiation environment beyond Earth's magnetosphere is fundamentally incompatible with human biology over extended periods. This is not an engineering problem. This is a physics problem. Let me show you what he meant. In 1972, in August, there was a solar particle event, a massive eruption from the sun that sent a wave of radiation through the solar system. It happened between the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 missions. If astronauts had been on the moon during that event, they would have received a dose of radiation lethal enough to kill them within days, even inside their spacecraft. And we got lucky the Apollo program missed it by pure chance. Now, here's what's going to blow your mind. We can't predict these events with enough accuracy to keep astronauts safe. The sun is a chaotic system. Solar physicists can give us warnings maybe 30 minutes to a few hours before a major event hits. But on a Mars mission, astronauts would be in transit for 6 to 9 months each way. The statistical probability of encountering a major solar particle event during a Mars mission is nearly 100%. You might be thinking, can't we just build better shielding? This is where physics gets really cruel. To shield against galactic cosmic rays effectively, you'd need about 20 feet of solid rock surrounding your spacecraft. Let me translate that into weight. That's approximately 500 tons of shielding material for a spacecraft the size of the International Space Station. The Saturn V rocket, the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown, could lift about 140 tons to low Earth orbit. Do the math. It's not even close. Elon Musk's Starship, the rocket he claims will take humans to Mars, has a payload capacity of about 100 tons to low Earth orbit, and much less for a Mars trajectory. Even if you stripped away every single system not absolutely essential for survival, you couldn't carry enough shielding. And here's the kicker. The shielding material itself becomes radioactive when struck by cosmic rays, creating secondary radiation inside the spacecraft. You'd be building a death trap with extra steps. Some engineers have proposed using water as shielding, surrounding the crew compartment with tanks of water that could also serve as life support. Sounds clever, right? Here's the problem. You'd need about 500 tons of water to provide adequate shielding. And water doesn't stay water in the extreme temperature swings of space. It freezes, it boils, it sublimates. Managing that much water in microgravity while maintaining structural integrity would require systems so massive and complex that they'd exceed the payload capacity before you even added the actual spacecraft. There's another approach some scientists have suggested: artificial magnetosphere generation. Create a magnetic field around the spacecraft to deflect charged particles, just like Earth does. The concept is theoretically sound, but here's the reality. Generating a magnetic field strong enough to deflect high-energy cosmic rays would require power levels equivalent to a small city's electrical grid running continuously for years. And where would that power come from? Solar panels? They degrade in radiation. Nuclear reactors? They're too heavy. Fusion reactors? We can't even make those work on Earth yet. Dr. Robert Zubrin, president of the Mars Society and one of the most vocal advocates for Mars colonization, has downplayed the radiation risk for years, arguing that astronauts could tolerate the exposure. But in 2020, a comprehensive study published in Nature by researchers at Georgetown University Medical Center revealed something horrifying. Cosmic ray exposure doesn't just damage DNA. It causes permanent changes to the brain's neural networks. The study, led by Dr. Charles Limoli, exposed mice to the equivalent of cosmic ray levels astronauts would experience on a Mars mission. The results were devastating. The mice showed significant cognitive impairment, memory loss, anxiety, and an inability to make decisions. Their neurons formed fewer connections, and the damage persisted long after the radiation exposure ended. They essentially gave the mice dementia. Now imagine you're an astronaut, 7 months into your journey to Mars. You need to make split-second decisions about spacecraft systems, medical emergencies, navigation corrections. But your brain is literally being rewired by radiation, your cognitive abilities declining day by day. By the time you reach Mars, you might not even be capable of landing the spacecraft safely. And here's something that should terrify you. We have no idea what happens to human reproduction in this radiation environment. The few studies done on mammalian reproduction in space suggest that radiation exposure would cause sterility, birth defects, and miscarriages at rates that would make any colony unsustainable. The dream of Mars colonization doesn't just die with the first generation. It dies before the first generation can even reproduce. But wait, because it gets worse. Radiation is just the first killer. It's the obvious one, the one scientists love to talk about because it's quantifiable. There are 3 other fundamental barriers to Mars that are even more insidious, even more impossible to overcome. And each one, by itself, would be enough to doom the mission? Are you starting to feel that creeping dread yet? That realization that everything you've been told about Mars has been a carefully constructed fantasy? Because we're just getting started. The radiation problem is the shallow end of this nightmare. What comes next is going to make radiation look like a minor inconvenience. But before we go deeper, I need you to do something. Think about how you felt 5 minutes ago when you started this video. You probably believed Mars missions were difficult, but achievable, right? Just an engineering challenge, waiting for enough funding and innovation. Hold on to that feeling, because in the next section, we're going to explore the second killer. And when you understand it, you'll realize that every single video you've ever watched about Mars colonization was either made by people who didn't understand the science, or by people who did understand it and chose to lie to you anyway. The question is, which is worse? Let's talk about something that sounds mundane compared to radiation, but is actually more immediately lethal: bone loss. And I don't mean the gradual weakening you might imagine. I'm talking about a physiological catastrophe so rapid and severe that it would cripple astronauts before they even landed on Mars. Here's what happens in microgravity, and this is documented by decades of ISS research. Astronauts lose bone density at a rate of 1% to 2% per month. That might not sound like much until you do the math. A 9-month journey to Mars means losing 9% to 18% of your bone density in transit. For reference, osteoporosis is diagnosed when you've lost 25% of your bone mass. And at that point, bones become so fragile they can break from minor impacts. But here's the part that destroys the Mars mission concept. This bone loss is concentrated in critical load-bearing bones. Your hips, your spine, your femurs, the bones that allow you to walk, to stand, to function as a terrestrial animal. Dr. Scott Smith, NASA's Nutritional Biochemistry Lab Manager, published research in 2012 showing that astronauts on the ISS, despite exercising 2 hours daily with resistance equipment specifically designed to prevent bone loss, still experienced severe skeletal deterioration. Now imagine you're an astronaut arriving at Mars after 9 months in zero gravity. Your bones are already compromised. And Mars's gravity is 38% of Earth's. Not enough to stop bone loss, but enough to put stress on your already weakened skeleton. You step out of the spacecraft, and your femur could fracture under your own reduced weight. No rescue helicopter is coming. No emergency room exists within 140 million miles. You're done. Think of it like this. Your bones are like a bank account, and calcium is the currency. On Earth, gravity is constantly forcing you to spend calcium on maintaining bone strength every step, every movement, every moment of standing. Your body deposits and withdraws calcium in perfect balance. But in microgravity, your body looks at your calcium account and says, Why are we maintaining all this expensive bone? There's no gravitational stress to resist, so it starts withdrawing calcium and never depositing it back. Your bones are getting liquidated, and there's no stopping it. Dr. Thomas Lang, a radiologist at UC San Francisco, conducted detailed studies on astronaut bone loss using high-resolution CT scans. His findings, published in 2017, revealed something shocking. Bone loss isn't just about density. The microarchitecture of the bone itself degrades. The tiny structural elements that give bone its strength, the trabeculae, deteriorate so severely that even if bone density somehow recovered, the structural integrity wouldn't. It's like the difference between a solid concrete pillar and a concrete pillar riddled with holes. Same amount of material, completely different strength. And here's the nightmare scenario nobody wants to discuss. The calcium leaving your bones has to go somewhere. It floods your bloodstream, it's filtered by your kidneys, and forms kidney stones. Astronaut kidney stone rates are dramatically elevated in space. Now imagine you're 3 months into your Mars journey, and you develop a kidney stone. The pain is so excruciating that people have described it as worse than childbirth, worse than being shot. You're writhing in agony in microgravity, unable to receive proper medical care, unable to pass the stone because your urinary system doesn't function properly in zero gravity. And your mission has 6 more months to go. But let's say, hypothetically, you make it to Mars. You've somehow avoided fracturing your bones, somehow avoided kidney stones, somehow maintained enough skeletal integrity to function. You're now on Mars, and you need to stay there for at least 18 months, waiting for Earth and Mars to align properly for the return journey. What happens to your bones during that time? This is where it gets truly hopeless. Mars's gravity, at 38% of Earth's, sits in a catastrophic middle ground. It's not enough to maintain bone health, but it's enough to give you the illusion of normalcy. Research by Dr. Jeffrey Sutton, formerly NASA's director of the National Space Biomedical Research Institute, indicates that partial gravity environments might actually be worse than zero gravity for long-term health because they create inconsistent stress patterns on the skeleton. Your bones continue degrading on Mars, just at a slightly slower rate than in zero gravity. After 18 months on the surface and another 9 months for the return journey, you've been in reduced gravity for 3 years. Even with the most optimistic models, you're looking at 30% to 40% bone loss. Your skeleton at this point resembles that of an 80-year-old with severe osteoporosis. And you haven't even tried to re-enter Earth's gravity yet. The return to Earth would be catastrophic. NASA doctors have serious concerns that astronauts returning from Mars wouldn't be able to survive the re-entry forces. The acceleration of re-entry, the impact of landing, even with the most advanced shock absorption systems, could cause multiple fractures throughout the body. You'd need immediate hospitalization, possibly surgery to repair fractures, and years of rehabilitation with no guarantee of full recovery. Now, here's what's going to make your skin crawl. Every single astronaut who's gone to the ISS and returned has experienced this bone loss to varying degrees. And the ISS is just 250 miles above Earth. They can be evacuated in hours if needed. Mars is 140 million miles away at its closest approach, 250 million miles at its farthest. There is no evacuation. There is no rescue. If something goes wrong, you die. Period. Some researchers have proposed artificial gravity as a solution. Spin the spacecraft to create centrifugal force simulating gravity. Sounds perfect, right? Here's why it doesn't work. To generate even Mars-level gravity, which isn't enough to prevent bone loss anyway, you'd need to spin a spacecraft with a radius of about 100 meters at roughly 4 revolutions per minute. The engineering challenges are staggering. The structural stress, the gyroscopic effects on navigation, the Coriolis forces that would make movement inside the spacecraft nauseating and disorienting. NASA did studies on artificial gravity in the 1960s and 70s. They built rotating rooms and tested subjects inside them. The results were universally negative: severe motion sickness, spatial disorientation, inability to perform tasks, psychological distress. And that was on Earth, where subjects could leave the rotating environment whenever they wanted. Imagine being trapped in a spinning spacecraft for 9 months with no escape from the nausea and disorientation. There's another proposed solution: exercise. The ISS has sophisticated resistance equipment, a treadmill, a stationary bike, resistance devices. Astronauts work out 2 hours daily, every day, specifically to combat bone loss. And it doesn't work. It slows the bone loss slightly, but it doesn't stop it. Dr. Zhang Sibonga, a NASA bone discipline lead, published comprehensive studies showing that even with maximum exercise compliance, bone loss continues unabated. Now multiply those exercise requirements by the demands of a Mars mission. Astronauts would need to exercise even more intensively, maybe 3 to 4 hours daily, while also managing spacecraft systems, conducting research, maintaining their equipment, and dealing with the psychological stress of the mission. There aren't enough hours in the day, and there isn't enough space in the spacecraft for the equipment needed. But here's where this connects to something even more terrifying that we haven't discussed yet: muscle atrophy. Your muscles are degrading even faster than your bones. In microgravity, astronauts lose 20% of their muscle mass within the first 2 weeks. 20%. In 2 weeks. The most critical muscles affected are the postural muscles your back, your core, your legs, the muscles that keep you upright and mobile. Dr. Kenneth Baldwin, a muscle physiologist at UC Irvine, has studied the cellular mechanisms of muscle atrophy in space. His research shows that microgravity doesn't just cause muscles to shrink, it causes them to fundamentally change their composition. Fast-twitch muscle fibers convert to slow-twitch. The proteins that generate force begin to break down, and the muscle's ability to regain mass becomes impaired. It's not just atrophy. It's transformation into a weaker, less functional tissue. By the time astronauts reach Mars, they've lost 40% to 50% of their muscle mass. They arrive at a planet where they need to perform physically demanding tasks: unloading equipment, setting up habitats, conducting geological surveys, repairing systems with half the muscle mass they started with. And remember, their bones are also compromised, so they can't even train intensively to rebuild muscle without risking fractures. The Soviet Salyut and Mir space station programs learned this the hard way. Cosmonauts returning from long-duration missions 6 months to a year had to be carried out of their spacecraft. They couldn't walk. Some couldn't even sit up without assistance. They required weeks to months of intensive rehabilitation to regain basic mobility. And those were missions in low Earth orbit, where rescue and medical support were immediately available. Here's a moment I need you to really absorb. Every plan you've ever seen for Mars colonization shows astronauts bouncing around the Martian surface, exploring, working, building. Those images are lies. The physical reality is that astronauts would arrive at Mars as fragile, weakened versions of themselves, barely capable of basic tasks, constantly at risk of injury that would be fatal given the lack of medical facilities. And we haven't even talked about the heart yet. Your cardiovascular system in microgravity undergoes dramatic changes. On Earth, your heart works against gravity to pump blood to your brain. In space, suddenly there's no gravitational gradient. Blood redistributes to your upper body and head. Your face gets puffy, your legs get skinny, and your heart, recognizing that it doesn't need to work as hard, begins to atrophy just like your muscles. Research by Dr. James Thomas, NASA's lead scientist for the cardiovascular discipline, published in 2014, showed that astronaut hearts become more spherical and lose mass during long-duration spaceflight. The heart muscle itself weakens. Upon return to Earth, Astronauts experience orthostatic intolerance. They stand up and their blood pressure drops because their heart can no longer pump blood effectively against gravity. Many pass out. Some need weeks to recover normal cardiovascular function. Now imagine returning from Mars, where you've spent 3 years in reduced gravity. Your heart has adapted to not fighting gravity for 3 years. You re-enter Earth's atmosphere, and suddenly gravity slams back to full force. Your weakened heart tries to pump blood to your brain, and it can't. You lose consciousness. If you're lucky, you wake up. If you're not, your brain suffers damage from oxygen deprivation, or you have a stroke, or your heart simply gives out. The data from long-duration ISS missions shows cardiovascular decline continues the longer astronauts stay in space. There appears to be no plateau, no point where the degradation stops. It just keeps getting worse. Scott Kelly, the American astronaut who spent 340 consecutive days on the ISS, experienced cardiovascular changes so severe that his doctors noted some might be permanent. And he was in low Earth orbit, where gravity was still 90% of Earth's surface value, not the near-zero gravity of interplanetary space. What if I told you that the bone loss, muscle atrophy, and cardiovascular decline aren't separate problems? They're symptoms of a fundamental incompatibility between human biology and spaceflight? Your body evolved over millions of years in Earth's gravity well. Every system, every cell, every biological process is calibrated for 1G. Remove that, and the entire organism begins failing. Some transhumanist enthusiasts argue that we could genetically engineer humans to be more suited for space, or use pharmaceutical interventions to prevent these degradations. But here's the reality. We don't even fully understand the mechanisms causing these changes, let alone how to prevent them. We've tried every drug, every exercise protocol, every nutritional supplement we can think of, and nothing stops the decline. Dr. Peter Lee, a space medicine researcher, made a sobering observation in 2019. We've been trying to solve the microgravity health problem for 60 years. Since Yuri Gagarin first went to space, we've spent billions of dollars on research, and we're no closer to a solution than we were in 1961. Maybe that's telling us something. Maybe human bodies simply cannot survive long-duration spaceflight without suffering irreversible damage. Think about what that means. Every Mars mission concept assumes astronauts will be functional when they arrive. Every plan depends on humans being able to work, to think, to perform complex tasks in a hostile environment with no backup. But the physiological reality is that they'll arrive crippled, weakened, and possibly cognitively impaired from radiation exposure. The mission is compromised before it begins. And here's what's absolutely chilling. There's a fourth killer we haven't even touched yet, one that makes all of these physical problems seem almost manageable by comparison. It's a killer that's invisible, that can't be measured by medical equipment, that doesn't show up in CT scans or blood tests. It's a killer that destroyed sailors on long voyages, that drove Antarctic explorers insane. That's been the dark secret of every isolated, confined environment humans have ever endured. I'm talking about the human mind. And what Mars will do to human psychology makes radiation, bone loss, and muscle atrophy look like minor inconveniences. Your skeleton is disintegrating, your muscles are wasting away, your heart is weakening, and we haven't even gotten to the part that actually ends the mission. Are you ready to go deeper? Isolation, confinement, sensory deprivation. These words don't begin to capture the psychological nightmare of a Mars mission. Let me paint you a picture of what astronauts would actually experience. And by the end of this section, you'll understand why psychological breakdown isn't a risk factor, it's a certainty. You're in a spacecraft roughly the size of a studio apartment, sometimes smaller. You're sharing this space with 5 to 7 other people. There are no windows showing the stars, too much radiation exposure. There's no privacy, every square inch is accounted for, monitored, necessary. The walls are always the same. The air smells stale, recycled through filters that can't quite remove the human odor of 7 people living in a can. The lighting is artificial, unchanging. And you're in this environment for 9 months. No escape, no possibility of leaving, no emergency exit. The famous Mars 500 experiment, conducted by Russia's Institute of Biomedical Problems from 2010 to 2011, simulated a Mars mission with 6 crew members sealed in a spacecraft mock-up for 520 days. This was on Earth, in Moscow, where the crew knew they could theoretically leave if a true emergency occurred. The results were deeply disturbing. Dr. David Dinges, a psychiatrist who analyzed the crew's data, found that crew members experienced severe sleep disturbances, depression, lethargy, and interpersonal conflicts that escalated dangerously. Their cognitive performance declined progressively throughout the mission. Reaction times slowed. Decision-making ability deteriorated. Some crew members became nearly catatonic, barely able to complete basic tasks. And this was a simulation where everyone knew it would eventually end. Now imagine the same scenario, except you're actually in space. You can't leave. There is no emergency extraction. If conflict escalates, there's nowhere to go. If depression becomes suicidal, there's no psychiatric hospital. If someone has a psychotic break, there's no sedative strong enough, no restraints adequate, no trained psychiatric staff. You're 50 million to 250 million miles from any help, traveling through a void that would kill you in 90 seconds if you stepped outside. The Antarctic research stations provide another terrifying preview. During the winter over period, when stations are completely isolated for months, researchers have documented what they call winter over syndrome, a constellation of psychological symptoms, including depression, hostility, sleep disturbances, cognitive impairment, and interpersonal conflict. People who were friends become enemies. Marriages have fallen apart. Violence has occurred. The most disturbing case is the 1999 stabbing at Vostok Station in Antarctica, where a Russian scientist stabbed a colleague after a chess game argument. The victim survived, but only because there happened to be a doctor present who could provide emergency care. On a Mars spacecraft, with limited medical supplies and no trained surgeon, that stabbing would likely have been fatal. And now you have a dead crew member and a murderer sealed in a spacecraft together for months. Dr. Nick Kanas, a psychiatrist who studied astronaut psychology for NASA, PUBLISHED, research showing that the most common psychological issues in space aren't individual mental health problems. They're interpersonal conflicts. He calls it the third quarter phenomenon, where crew cohesion breaks down around 75% of the way through a mission. People become irritable, hostile, withdrawn. Communication deteriorates. The crew begins to split into factions. And this is on relatively short missions measured in months, not the multi-year duration of a Mars mission. Think of it like this. Imagine you're forced to live in your bathroom with your coworkers. Forever. No leaving. The same people, the same space, the same routine, day after day after day. How long before you start hating them? How long before the sound of someone chewing makes you want to commit violence? How long before the isolation drives you into depression so deep you can't function? And here's what makes it exponentially worse: the time delay in communications with Earth. As you travel toward Mars, radio signals take longer and longer to arrive. At Mars's closest approach to Earth, the delay is about 3 minutes one-way, 6 minutes for a conversation. At maximum distance, it's 22 minutes one-way, 44 minutes for a conversation. Real-time communication becomes impossible. You can't call home when you're feeling depressed. You can't video chat with loved ones. Every conversation is asynchronous, delayed, disconnected. Psychologists know that real-time social connection is essential for mental health. It's not optional. It's fundamental to human psychological functioning. Remove it, and people deteriorate. the Mars 500 experiment crew members, despite being able to send messages to family and friends, experienced significant psychological decline, partly because the communication delays made conversations feel hollow and unsatisfying. Now add another psychological stressor. You're on the first Mars mission. The entire world is watching. Billions of people following your every move. Every decision you make, every mistake, every moment of weakness is broadcast and analyzed. The pressure to perform perfectly, to never show vulnerability, to be a hero, it's crushing. Astronauts call it the goldfish bowl effect, and it's psychologically exhausting. Dr. Cheryl Bishop, a NASA psychologist who's researched crew psychology in analog environments, has warned repeatedly that the psychological challenges of a Mars mission may be insurmountable with current selection and training methods. She said, quote, "We have no idea how to keep a crew psychologically healthy for a 3-year mission in a hostile environment with no possibility of evacuation. We're essentially sending people on a suicide mission and hoping they don't realize it until it's too late to turn back." That's a NASA psychologist, by the way. Someone whose job is to make space missions work. And she's essentially saying it can't be done. There's another psychological factor that nobody wants to discuss, the overview effect in reverse. Astronauts on the ISS often report the overview effect, a profound cognitive shift from seeing Earth from space, realizing how small and fragile our planet is, feeling a deep connection to humanity and the environment. It's beautiful, transcendent, life-changing. But what happens when Earth becomes a pale blue dot? When you're so far away that Earth is just another star in the sky? Research suggests this could trigger an existential crisis, a profound sense of disconnection and meaninglessness. You're too far from Earth to feel connected to it, but you haven't reached Mars yet. You're in between, in the void, and the human mind isn't equipped to handle that level of isolation from everything familiar. Some psychologists have speculated that this could trigger a condition they've termed cosmic loneliness, a unique form of psychological distress where the vastness of space and the insignificance of human existence become overwhelming. Crew members might become catatonic, suicidal, or develop psychotic symptoms. And there's no treatment protocol, because we've never encountered this condition before. Let's talk about sleep, because it's both mundane and absolutely critical. In space, your circadian rhythm, your body's internal clock, becomes dysregulated. There's no sunrise or sunset, no natural light cycle. The ISS orbits Earth every 90 minutes, meaning astronauts see 16 sunrises and sunsets per day. This confuses the hell out of your circadian system. Astronauts report severe insomnia, fragmented sleep, and reliance on sleeping pills. Dr. Charles Cheisler, a Harvard sleep researcher who's consulted for NASA, has documented that astronauts sleep on average 6 hours per night instead of the recommended 8, and the quality of that sleep is poor. They wake frequently, have difficulty falling asleep, and wake feeling unrefreshed. Chronic sleep deprivation causes cognitive impairment, mood disturbances, impaired immune function, an increased risk of errors. Now imagine 9 months of poor sleep, followed by 18 months on Mars, where the day-night cycle is 24 hours and 37 minutes. Just different enough from Earth's 24-hour cycle to constantly keep your circadian rhythm off-kilter, followed by another 9 months of poor sleep on the return journey. We're talking about 3 years of chronic sleep deprivation. Your cognitive function would be devastated. Your ability to respond to emergencies would be compromised. You'd be making decisions with the mental acuity of someone severely intoxicated. Here's something that's going to disturb you. We actually have data on what happens to humans in long-term isolation and confinement, and it all points towards psychological breakdown. Submariners on extended patrols, especially those on nuclear submarines that don't surface for months, experience high rates of depression, anxiety, and interpersonal conflict. And they have the knowledge that they'll eventually return to port, that they can potentially surface in an emergency. Antarctic researchers in winter rover conditions have higher rates of depression, substance abuse, and suicide than the general population. Prisoners in solitary confinement experience severe psychological deterioration, hallucinations, paranoia, cognitive impairment, self-harm. And Mars astronauts would be experiencing a combination of all these stressors: isolation, confinement, sensory deprivation, distance from loved ones, inability to escape, and a constant proximity to death. Dr. Jack Stuster, an anthropologist who studied isolated confined environments for NASA, analyzed the journals and logs from Antarctic expeditions, submarine patrols, and long-duration space missions. His findings are grim. In every case, psychological problems intensified over time. Conflicts that started as minor irritations escalated into serious interpersonal breakdowns. Individuals who started missions healthy and optimistic ended them depressed and traumatized. One of the most haunting observations from his research: in extreme isolation, people begin to develop what he calls psychological convergence, where crew members start to mirror each other's negative psychological states. If one person becomes depressed, it spreads through the crew like a contagion. If one person becomes hostile, others respond in kind. The psychological health of the crew isn't determined by individuals. It's an emergent property of the group, and it tends toward breakdown. Now, here's what should terrify you about Mars mission planning. NASA's psychological screening for astronauts is designed to select exceptionally mentally healthy, stable, resilient individuals. These are people who've passed rigorous psychological testing, who've demonstrated stress tolerance in extreme situations, who have strong social skills and emotional regulation. These are, by definition, the best candidates humanity can produce. And they still experience psychological problems in space. They still develop sleep disturbances, mood issues, and interpersonal conflicts. If our best people struggle on 6-month ISS missions with constant contact with Earth, what happens to them on a 3-year Mars mission with communication delays and no possibility of return? Some space agencies have proposed using pharmaceutical interventions, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, sleep aids, to manage psychological problems on Mars missions. But here's the problem. We don't know how these medications work in the space environment. Microgravity affects drug metabolism. Radiation exposure might alter drug effectiveness. And relying on medications for 3 years creates dependency and doesn't address the underlying environmental stressors causing the psychological problems. There's also the terrifying possibility of what psychiatrists call brief psychotic episodes, sudden onset psychosis, triggered by extreme stress. Someone who's been holding it together suddenly snaps. They become delusional, paranoid, potentially violent. This has happened in Antarctic stations and military deployments. In those cases, the person can be evacuated and treated. On a Mars spacecraft, if someone has a psychotic break, the crew has to manage it themselves with limited resources and no psychiatric expertise. Imagine you're an astronaut, and one of your crew members wakes up one day convinced that the others are trying to kill him. He becomes agitated, aggressive. There's no psychiatric hospital, no emergency hotline, no trained intervention team. You have to physically restrain him, possibly for weeks or months, while trying to continue operating the spacecraft and managing your own psychological stress. The mission is over at that point. You're just trying to survive long enough to get home. Dr. Kathy Sullivan, a former astronaut and NASA administrator, has said in interviews that psychological breakdown is the nightmare scenario nobody wants to acknowledge. She said, "We can engineer solutions for radiation, for life support, for propulsion, but we can't engineer the human psyche. And we're sending people into an environment that will systematically destroy their mental health, with no way to help them." Here's the part that connects everything together in the most disturbing way possible. All these psychological stressors are happening simultaneously with the physical deterioration we discussed earlier. Your bones are dissolving. Your muscles are wasting. Your cardiovascular system is failing. You're being bombarded by radiation. You're chronically sleep deprived, and you're psychologically isolated in a confined space for years. These aren't separate problems. They compound each other exponentially. Physical pain and disability cause depression. Depression causes poor sleep. Poor sleep impairs cognitive function and emotional regulation. Emotional dysregulation causes interpersonal conflict. Interpersonal conflict increases stress. Stress accelerates physical deterioration. It's a death spiral with no exit. Think of it like this. Imagine you're running a marathon, but your legs are breaking with every step. You haven't slept properly in months, and you're locked in a closet with people you've come to hate. How far would you make it? How long before you just gave up? Because that's the psychological reality of a Mars mission stripped of all the heroic narratives. And here's what's going to haunt you. Space agencies know this. The research is clear. The data is unambiguous. Psychological breakdown on a Mars mission isn't a possibility. It's a statistical certainty. Yet they keep promoting Mars missions, keep building spacecraft, keep selecting astronauts. Why? Because admitting that human psychology can't handle Mars means admitting that the entire vision of space exploration beyond low Earth orbit is fundamentally flawed. But we're not done yet. We've covered radiation, physical deterioration, and psychological collapse. 3 insurmountable barriers. But there's a 4th one that ties all of this together, and it's the most insidious because it doesn't care about engineering, solutions, or medical interventions, or psychological screening. It's a problem of mathematics and physics, so fundamental that it makes every other challenge irrelevant. I'm talking about the tyranny of the rocket equation. And once you understand it, you'll realize that Mars missions aren't just difficult or dangerous. They're thermodynamically implausible. The universe itself is conspiring against us. But before we get to that final nail in the coffin, I want you to think about something. Right now, at this moment, there are engineers at SpaceX, at NASA, at space agencies around the world working on Mars mission plans. They're building rockets, testing life support systems, training astronauts. And every single one of them knows, at some level, that what they're working on probably won't work. They know about the radiation. They know about the bone loss. They know about the psychological challenges. So why do they keep going? Is it denial? Is it hope that some breakthrough will solve these problems? Is it the money, the prestige, the dream? Or is it something darker, the knowledge that if they admit these missions are impossible, their entire careers become meaningless, their life's work evaporates, and humanity has to confront a future where we're trapped on this one fragile planet forever? I'll let you decide. But as we move into the next section, remember this. Every problem we've discussed so far assumes we can actually get to Mars in the first place. And that's where the math becomes truly, devastatingly hopeless. The rocket equation. It's deceptively simple, formulated by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in 1897, and it's the fundamental mathematical law that governs all spaceflight. Here it is in plain language. The amount of fuel you need to reach a destination increases exponentially with the weight of your spacecraft. Not linearly, exponentially. Let me show you why this destroys the Mars dream. To reach Mars, you need to accelerate a spacecraft to approximately 12 kilometers per second. That's about 27,000 miles per hour. To do this, you need fuel. But fuel has weight. So to carry more fuel, you need more fuel to lift that fuel. And to carry that additional fuel, you need even more fuel. The numbers spiral out of control viciously fast. Dr. Robert Zubrin loves to downplay this in his Mars Direct proposals. But let's look at the actual mathematics. A spacecraft massing 100 tons that needs to reach Mars requires approximately 900 tons of fuel using current chemical propulsion technology. That's a 1-to-9 mass ratio. You need 9 times as much fuel as payload. But wait now, Your spacecraft isn't 100 tons. It's 1,000 tons, payload plus fuel. To get that 1,000 tons moving requires even more fuel. The math cascades. This is why the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever successfully built, was 85% fuel by weight. 85%. Only 15% was rocket structure and payload. And that was just to get to low Earth orbit. To go to the moon required multiple stages, fuel calculations so precise that a single error would doom the mission. And even then, the payload that actually reached the moon was tiny compared to what launched from Earth. Now scale that up to Mars. Dr. Franklin Chung Diaz, a former astronaut and physicist, calculated that a crewed Mars mission using chemical propulsion would require a spacecraft weighing approximately 4,000 to 5,000 tons in low Earth orbit before departure. That's not a typo. 4,000 to 5,000 tons. The International Space Station, which took 30 countries and over 100 launches to build, masses about 420 tons. A Mars spacecraft needs to be 10 times more massive. Think of it like this. Imagine you want to drive across the country, but your car can only carry enough gas to go 50 miles. So you load the trunk with gas cans. But gas cans are heavy, so now you need more gas just to carry the gas. And that extra gas needs more gas to carry it. Eventually, your car is 95% gas and 5% car, and you still can't make it across the country because the weight of all that fuel crushes your suspension and you can't move at all. That's the rocket equation. It's a physical law as fundamental as gravity or thermodynamics. And it doesn't care about human ambition or determination or funding levels. The math is the math. Elon Musk's Starship is supposed to solve this problem through full reusability and in-orbit refueling. The plan is to launch the Starship to orbit, then launch multiple tanker Starships to refuel it, then send it to Mars. Sounds reasonable until you run the numbers. To fully fuel a Starship in orbit for a Mars mission requires approximately 8 to 12 refueling launches. Each of those launches costs fuel, money, time, and introduces failure points. And here's the kicker. Every single one of those launches has to work perfectly. If one tanker launch fails, if one refueling operation goes wrong, if there's any leak or malfunction, the entire mission is scrubbed. You've just spent hundreds of millions of dollars and months of time to achieve nothing. The reliability requirements are so extreme that they border on fantasy. Dr. John Brophy, a propulsion expert at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, has pointed out that we've never successfully transferred cryogenic propellants in orbit. Never. Not once. The Starship mission architecture depends on doing this 8 to 12 times flawlessly for every single Mars mission. It's assuming we'll master a technology we've never demonstrated, make it routine, and execute it perfectly every time with no failures. But let's say, hypothetically, we solve the refueling problem. We get the spacecraft to Mars. Now we need to land it. Mars's atmosphere is thick enough to create heat during entry, requiring heat shields and precise calculations, but too thin to slow down the spacecraft sufficiently with parachutes alone. You need propulsive landing, which means you need fuel. More fuel. Fuel that you've been carrying with you the entire journey. Fuel that made your spacecraft heavier. Fuel that required even more fuel to transport. The Mars Science Laboratory mission, the rover Curiosity, had a mass of 900 kilograms. Landing it required the most complex landing system ever devised, called the Sky Crane, which used 8 rocket engines and required years of development and testing. And that was for a 900-kilogram rover. A crewed spacecraft would mass 50 to 100 tons or more. The fuel requirements for landing that much mass on Mars are staggering, and that fuel needs to be carried from Earth. Now, here's where it gets truly impossible. You also need fuel for the return journey. The Mars mission isn't one way, unless you're proposing a suicide mission, which some people have actually suggested. You need to get off Mars, travel back to Earth, and perform re-entry. That requires fuel. A lot of fuel. Fuel that's been sitting on Mars for 18 months waiting for the return window. Some proposals suggest manufacturing fuel on Mars using in-situ resource utilization, extracting water from the Martian soil, using electrolysis to create hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel. Sounds clever. Here's the problem. This requires complex industrial equipment, power sources, and time. You need to land equipment on Mars well before the crew arrives, deploy it robotly, and have it operate autonomously for months or years producing fuel. Every part of this system is a failure point. Dr. Robert Brown, former NASA chief technologist, has stated that in-situ resource utilization on Mars is theoretically possible, but practically unproven. We've never extracted water from Mars soil. We've never processed it into rocket fuel on another planet. We've never stored cryogenic propellants on Mars for extended periods. We're assuming technologies that don't exist will work perfectly on the first try, on another planet, with no human intervention, in conditions we can't fully test on Earth. And here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. Even if one component of this system fails, the astronauts are stranded on Mars forever. If the fuel production system doesn't work, if the fuel storage fails, if there's any contamination or leak, the return spacecraft can't launch. The crew has food and life support for maybe 18 to 24 months. After that, they starve to death or suffocate on another planet while the entire world watches helplessly. Think about the psychological impact of that. You're an astronaut on Mars, and mission control informs you that the fuel production system failed. You're not coming home. You have 18 months of supplies left. What do? Do you conserve resources and extend your survival as long as possible? Do you end it quickly? Do you keep working on science, knowing it's meaningless because you'll never deliver the data back to Earth? The mission becomes a public execution, streamed live to billions of people. This has actually been discussed in space ethics circles. Dr. Paul Root-Wolpe, NASA's former bioethicist, has written about the moral implications of missions where crew survival isn't guaranteed. He's pointed out that we have no ethical framework for sending people on missions where death is a probable outcome. It's not like dangerous professions where people accept risks. This is sending people to die for symbolic value, for propaganda, for national prestige. But let's return to the rocket equation, because there's an even more fundamental problem we haven't addressed. Velocity requirements change based on planetary positions. The best launch windows for Mars occur every 26 months when Earth and Mars are properly aligned. Miss that window, and you wait more than 2 years for the next one. But the delta V requirements, the velocity change needed, vary significantly depending on the exact positions of the planets. Some launch windows are more favorable than others. The difference in fuel requirements between a good window and a bad window can be 20% to 30%. That might not sound like much, but remember the exponential nature of the rocket equation. A 30% increase in delta V requirements might mean a 100% increase in fuel needed, which doubles the mass, which requires more fuel, which cascades out of control. Dr. James Lunguski, a professor of aeronautical engineering at Purdue University, has calculated that some Mars mission opportunities are simply not feasible given current propulsion technology and spacecraft mass constraints. The planets align, but the math doesn't. We'd need to wait for particularly favorable orbital configurations, which only occur a few times per century, and even then, the margins are razor thin. Here's another aspect of the rocket equation that destroys Mars plans: abort scenarios. On Apollo missions to the Moon, astronauts had abort options at every phase of the mission. During launch, they could separate the command module and return to Earth. During lunar orbit, they could skip the landing and return immediately. Even during the landing, they could abort and return to orbit. The spacecraft was designed with abort capabilities because NASA learned from early disasters that crew survival requires escape options. A Mars mission has no abort options. Once you're on the trajectory to Mars, what's called trans-Mars injection, you're committed. You can't turn around. The fuel requirements to reverse course and return to Earth exceed what the spacecraft could possibly carry. If something goes wrong, equipment failure, medical emergency, solar particle event, you can't abort. You either continue to Mars or you die in space. There is no plan B. The Mars 500 study asked crew members about their psychological response to this reality. Even though they knew it was a simulation, the knowledge that in a real mission there would be no abort option caused significant psychological distress. Several crew members reported nightmares about being trapped on a trajectory to Mars while spacecraft systems failed around them. And this was on Earth in a simulation where they could literally walk out the door anytime they wanted. Now let me connect this back to the radiation problem we discussed earlier. Remember those solar particle events that could deliver lethal doses of radiation? The ideal solution would be to have enough fuel to perform evasive maneuvers, accelerate or decelerate to change your position relative to the radiation storm, or have enough power and fuel to quickly construct additional shielding. But the rocket equation says you can't carry that much fuel. Every kilogram of extra fuel for safety margins is a kilogram you can't use for life support, equipment, or return fuel. Mission planners are forced into impossible choices. Carry more shielding and life support but less safety margin? Carry more fuel for emergencies but less food? Every decision involves trading one survival requirement against another. And the margins are so tight that there's no good answer. You're always sacrificing something critical. Dr. Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut who commanded the ISS, has said in interviews that Mars mission planning involves betting astronauts' lives on every system working perfectly for 3 years straight. His exact words, "We don't have redundancy for redundancy. We have barely enough to get there if nothing goes wrong. And in space, something always goes wrong." Let me give you a concrete example of how thin these margins are. The Apollo 13 mission had an oxygen tank explode, crippling the spacecraft. The crew survived through a combination of luck, skill, and the fact that they were only 3 days from Earth. Mission Control had time to calculate solutions, test them on simulators, and guide the crew through repairs. The crew could afford to shut down systems and coast on minimal power because they only needed to survive for a few more days. On a Mars mission, if a critical system fails 3 months into the journey, you have 6 months left to Mars and 9 months back to Earth. You can't shut down life support. You can't coast. You need active temperature control, air recycling, water recycling, radiation monitoring, course corrections. Every system has to continue functioning perfectly for months with no possibility of resupply or repair beyond what the crew can improvise. The probability of a mission-critical failure during a 3-year Mars mission, based on ISS reliability data, is estimated at 30% to 40%. That's not a worst-case scenario. That's the actual statistical likelihood based on how often things break on the ISS, where we can send replacement parts on the next resupply mission. On Mars, when something breaks, it stays broken. Here's what's truly damning. NASA's own internal assessments have concluded that with current technology, a crewed Mars mission has an unacceptable risk level. The exact numbers are classified, but former NASA officials have indicated that the estimated probability of crew loss is around 40% to 50%. That means every Mars mission, as currently conceived, is a coin flip on whether the astronauts survive. For comparison, NASA's acceptable risk level for crew loss on any mission is generally set at around 1%. The space shuttle was later calculated to have about a 1 in 100 risk of catastrophic failure, which is exactly what it experienced 2 losses in 135 missions. A Mars mission with 40% crew loss probability is 40 times more dangerous than NASA's risk tolerance. It's not acceptable. It's not even close. But here's the part that should make you angry. Space agencies keep promoting Mars missions anyway. They keep showing animations of astronauts on Mars, keep releasing timelines, keep allocating budgets. Why? Because admitting the mission is impossible means admitting that decades of work, billions in funding, and countless careers have been pursuing a fantasy. Dr. Chris Impey, an astronomer at the University of Arizona, wrote a provocative article in 2019 titled "Mars is a Mirage." His argument, backed by detailed analysis, the technical, physiological, and economic barriers to Mars are so severe that the mission is effectively impossible with any technology we can reasonably develop in the next century. Not difficult, impossible. He calculated that a realistic Mars program, one that actually addressed all the challenges we've discussed: radiation shielding, artificial gravity, reliable life support, in situ resource utilization, adequate medical facilities, psychological support systems, would require a spacecraft massing at least 10,000 tons and costing conservatively $500 billion to $1 trillion per mission. That's more than the entire Apollo program adjusted for inflation, for a single mission with maybe a 50% survival rate. Think about what that means economically. No government will fund $1 trillion mission with those odds. No private company could possibly recoup that investment. There's no economic return on Mars. No resources valuable enough to justify retrieval. No scientific data worth $1 trillion. No strategic value that justifies the cost. It's pure prestige, pure symbolism, and nobody's going to spend $1 trillion on symbolism when the astronauts will probably die anyway. What if I told you that every Mars mission proposal you've ever seen has been lying through omission? They show you the successful scenario, a spacecraft that launches perfectly, travels safely, lands successfully, returns triumphantly. They don't show you the probability trees, the failure modes, the cascading catastrophes that are statistically far more likely. They don't show you the spacecraft tumbling out of control after a micrometeorite punctures a fuel tank. They don't show you the crew slowly starving because the life support system failed and they can't grow enough food. They don't show you the astronaut who develops appendicitis halfway to Mars and dies screaming because there's no surgeon and no operating room. They don't show you what happens when someone has a psychotic break and has to be physically restrained for 6 months. They don't show you the reality. Here's the most disturbing part. Some mission planners have privately suggested one-way missions as a solution to the rocket equation problem. Send astronauts to Mars with no return capability. Establish a permanent settlement. The astronauts become martyrs for humanity's expansion into space. It's been seriously discussed in scientific publications, debated at conferences, analyzed for feasibility. Dr. Dirk Schultz-Malkowy, a planetary scientist, actually published a proposal in 2010 advocating for one-way Mars missions, arguing that it would solve many of the mass and fuel problems. His argument: the early colonists of the Americas didn't expect to return either. But here's the difference. Those colonists had air to breathe, water to drink, food to harvest, and Earth's gravity and magnetosphere protecting them. Mars colonists would have none of those things. They'd be sentenced to a slow death on a frozen, irradiated desert where every breath, every drop of water, every meal depends on technology functioning perfectly forever. And forever is the key word. A Mars colony can never be self-sufficient, not with any technology we can envision. It would require constant resupply from Earth. If Earth decided to stop sending missions due to economic collapse, political change, war, or simple loss of interest, the colonists would die. Every person sent to Mars becomes a permanent dependent, a hostage to Earth's continued support. The rocket equation doesn't just make the first mission nearly impossible. It makes sustainable colonization thermodynamically absurd. Every supply mission faces the same exponential fuel requirements. Every spacecraft sent to support the colony requires 9 times its weight in fuel. The logistics become unsustainable almost immediately. Dr. Robert Zubrin's Mars Direct plan tries to solve this by using Mars resources. But as we've discussed, that technology is unproven and would require working perfectly on the first attempt. His entire plan is a house of cards. If any single element fails, people die. It's not a robust plan. It's a wishful thinking exercise that ignores the actual probability of cascading failures. Here's the mathematical reality. The rocket equation, combined with human physiological limitations, combined with the psychological challenges, combined with the radiation environment, creates what systems engineers call a tightly coupled system, where failure in any one area causes failure in all other areas. There are no independent safety margins. Everything depends on everything else working perfectly. And we know from decades of spaceflight experience that nothing ever works perfectly. Equipment fails. Humans make mistakes. Unexpected problems arise. The difference is that on ISS missions, when problems arise, we solve them with help from Earth. On Mars missions, when problems arise, people die. Think about what we've covered in this video so far. Radiation that will cause cancer and brain damage. Bone loss that will cripple astronauts. Muscle atrophy that will leave them unable to function. Psychological breakdown from isolation and confinement. And now the mathematical reality that we can barely deliver the mass and fuel needed to make the journey at all. Every single one of these is, by itself, nearly insurmountable. Together, they create a wall of impossibility so high that no amount of engineering cleverness or human determination can overcome it. But we're not done. There's one more section that ties all of this together, the economic and political reality that makes Mars missions not just technically impossible, but socially implausible. Because even if we solved every technical problem I've described, there's a fundamental question nobody wants to ask. Why? Why spend $1 trillion and risk human lives to go to Mars when the return on investment is essentially zero? Are you starting to feel it? That sinking realization that everything you've been told about humanity's future on Mars has been a carefully constructed illusion? That the inspiring videos, the ambitious timelines, the confident proclamations from billionaires and space agencies have been selling you a dream that basic physics and biology won't allow? Good. Hold on to that feeling. Because in the next section, we're going to explore the economic and political forces that keep this impossible. Dream alive despite all evidence against it. And once you understand that, you'll see the Mars mission for what it really is. Not a plan, but a propaganda tool. Not a destination, but a distraction. Not humanity's future, but humanity's greatest collective delusion. Let's talk about money, politics, and why the Mars mission persists despite being effectively impossible. Because once you understand the incentive structures keeping this fantasy alive, everything clicks into place. The Mars mission isn't about reaching Mars. It's about maintaining budgets, justifying careers, and selling a hopeful narrative to a public desperate to believe humanity has a backup plan for Earth. NASA's annual budget is approximately $25 billion. Of that, a significant portion, several billion dollars annually, is allocated toward Mars-related programs. The Mars 2020 Perseverance rover cost $2.7 billion. The Mars Sample Return mission, which will bring Martian soil back to Earth, not humans, just soil, is estimated at $7 to $11 billion and climbing. These are robotic missions. A crewed Mars mission would cost conservatively $500 billion to $1 trillion, spread over 20 to 30 years of development. Here's the question nobody asks. What are we getting for that money? What's the return on investment? Because unlike the Apollo program, which had clear geopolitical motivations, demonstrating American technological superiority over the Soviet Union during the Cold War, a Mars mission has no clear strategic value. There's no enemy to defeat, No existential threat to counter, no tangible benefit beyond, because it's cool.